All right. Good morning, everyone, and happy Sabbath. Thank you for joining us for Sabbath School this morning. So you might recognize some of the faces on with us. We are a small but mighty crew that are going to be leading the panel discussion with you today for Sabbath. And so let me just start by introducing our panelists. And so I don't know how it might be displayed on your screen, but for me on the top left corner is Anaya Harrison. And Anaya, thank you so much. Anaya is actually at the University of Delaware and is helping out as a resident assistant there. So she's very busy. So I'm thankful for you taking the time to join us for the panel tonight or this morning. And then we also have Amy Cromer, who is one of our church elders who's joining us. And Amy, thank you so much. I know Amy is a teacher, so it's been a long week of teaching, and we're happy that you're able to help us with the Sabbath school lesson morning. And then I'm Sarah Celestin, and I am going to be helping with moderating our discussion and helping on a couple days. So if you're following along and you're looking for which lesson we're on this week, we're going to be discussing lesson 5. And the title of our lesson is Jesus, the Giver of Rest, which I know these days, I feel like there's so many stressors and so many things going on in everybody's life that this is something we all need, is a way to find rest and restoration in Jesus. And so that's what we're going to be talking about this morning. So before we get started, I don't know if anybody would be willing to have opening prayer for us.
Sure,
Amy, do you mind? Okay. All right. That's
sure,
great.
good.
Thanks so much.
All right, let's bow our heads. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for the opportunity to come together and study your word with fellow Christian believers, with people who are just learning and people who have been learning their whole lives. And Lord, we just ask that you send your Holy Spirit upon us this day. Give us wisdom and understanding of your word. In your precious name, we pray. Amen.
Amen. Amen. All right, so we're going to kick it off. If you're following along with your Sabbath School Quarterly, we're going to be starting with Sabbath afternoon study, which was from January 22nd, and really kind of introducing us to some of the topics we're going to be talking about. So we're going to start with the memory text, which is actually found in Hebrews chapter 4. And so I'm going to back it up a little bit because this is actually Hebrews chapter 4, verse 9. But I want to back it up a little bit and talk about kind of what is happening here. So in this passage, there's a discussion going on around Sabbath rest. And what does that really mean for us to rest on Sabbath? And if we back up to verse 8, it says here, "For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken later about another day." And so it's kind of referring to a time where, people were overwhelmed, they were tired, they were restless. And it's saying here that if Joshua had been able to give those people kind of the rest that they were wanting, then God wouldn't have communicated at a later time in discussing the 10 commandments. He wouldn't have then spoken later about another day. And so then in verse 9, it says, "There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God." And then verse 10 goes on to say, "For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from his own work, just as God did from his." So it's really referring us back to when God gave the 10 commandments, and he said, "I rested during the creation time. I rested on the 7th day. And so this is the Sabbath where I rested, and I also want you to have rest during that time." And it's interesting because in our quarterly, the version I'm reading from the NIV, and so verse 9 says, "There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God." In our quarterly, it actually says, "There remains a rest for the people of God." And our study on Sabbath goes on to talk about, what type of rest are we talking about here? And it does discuss that the rest is described both as a rest belonging to God and as a Sabbath rest. And it talks about how when we keep the Sabbath and rest during that time, we're remembering that God made this perfect provision, this perfect situation for us to be able to rest in him. And, I think when I think about this, it always is a beautiful reminder about that really that God is the creator. He created everything, and then he rested on that seventh day after making all creation, not only for him to rest, but so that creation could rest and have that restoration and fulfillment with him. So I don't, I don't really have a question for Sabbath afternoon, but I think it kind of paints a beautiful picture of what God really wants for us, to be able to rest within him and with him on Sabbath, and for it to be a reminder for us of his creation. So we're going to move into Sunday because we have a couple different readings to do on Sunday. And Sunday's title is The Land as a Place of Rest. And so it starts off really talking about what promise God made to Abraham. So we're kind of taking it back to when Abraham, when God was delivering Israel from slavery, and it's saying here what promises were made at that time. And so I don't know, Anaya and Amy, like when you think about that, sometimes we don't really connect this with rest, but here they're pointing out the deliverance from slavery. Why do you think that they're connecting that with a place of rest? Any thoughts?
Anaya, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. I think it kind of goes into deeper about their physical and emotional space that they were in at the time. So physically, they were in a space where they weren't being paid for their labor, and they were being kind of abused by the Egyptians who were there. And I think that speaks to the fact that they didn't have physical rest, and that also can lead to not having like mental rest in that space too. So I think God just wanted to help remind them that they needed to create a space of rest for themselves in all aspects of their lives, and that deliverance out of slavery was like a physical reminder of the kind of untangible like promise that he'd given them of Sabbath.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I think that you're so right that, we think of kind of deliverance from the physical work and all that they were going through, but thinking about kind of all their whole being, like all the pressure that they were under, that they weren't accepted in that land. Not only were they working for nothing, but they were, not accepted in so many ways. So kind of deliverance from that, and God saw this as this, I'm going to bring you out of this and lead you to a place where you can really have that rest. So I think that it kind of shows that beautiful promise. We've talked about Sabbath and the connection to creation, but I think that this promise to Abraham is this promise that I'm going to bring you out of this difficult situation, bring your people out of this situation, and give you a place of rest, where at the time in Egypt, it didn't seem that there was going to be any rest for them. Amy, any additional thoughts? No? Okay.
No, I think.
So I think what I was going to do is have us read two different verses or two different passages to really look at, when we talk about Sabbath rest, what does that really commemorate? So I don't know if one of you would read Exodus 20 verses 8 to 11. And then the other passage is Deuteronomy 5, 12 to 15. So I don't know. You might want to do which one.
Okay, I'll do Deuteronomy.
Deuteronomy. Okay. So, and then Anaya, it's Exodus 20, 8 to 11. I'm going to turn there myself. And what we're really looking at here in these passages is what does it reveal to us about that's what Sabbath rest is really commemorating and how it's connected with Sabbath rest. Okay, so I think our first passage is Exodus 20, verses 8 to 11.
Okay, I'm reading from the New King James Version. It says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it.
Mhm. Thanks, Anaya. So maybe before we discuss that one, maybe we could read Deuteronomy, because I think it's kind of interesting to compare the two passages. So maybe if you want to read from Deuteronomy, we can go there next.
It was Deuteronomy 12, you said?
It's chapter 5, verse 12 to 15.
Let me
Trying
go
to get
back
there
to here.
myself here. Okay.
12 to 15. Okay.
12 to
And
15.
I'm reading from the NIV. Oh, turned one too many. Here we go. Observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy, as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your manservant or maidservant, nor your ox, your donkey, or any of your animals, nor the alien within your gates, so that your manservant and maidservant may rest as you do. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day.
So
Sounds familiar.
what I thought was interesting about these passages, when I first started reading, when I read the Deuteronomy passage, I said, oh, it's the same thing. It's just repeating the same thing.
Mhm.
But it has that whole part at the end in verse 15 around remembering the time that you were slaves in Egypt. And so, reading this, what do you think, what two things is it really pointing out that the Sabbath rest is commemorating? I don't know if you had thoughts about that after reading those two passages.
I was thinking it was commemorating an end of slavery, and it was also helping the children of Israel remember that time. But it also gave an example to people that owned, I guess, manservants and maidservants, or even aliens, which I'm suspecting is a visitor, that under certain circumstances, they should be honoring Sabbath too within your home. Does anybody? Those are my two thoughts.
Anaya, what do you think?
Yeah, I think I get that from it too. I think it's just a reminder, because the way I think about it, like God created our bodies and knows us and knows the toil that working all the 7 days would have on our bodies. And I think it's kind of a promise to between ourselves and him that we will kind of protect the space that he gave us. And part of that comes with giving that same privilege to the people who are under you. So I think, like, even in today's world, we could, like, in the modern age, we could compare this to like employers being like leaning on their employees, and like kind of that kind of relationship. So you're giving it to yourself and you're also giving it to those around you, and kind of having that same respect for the people around you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Like that. I'm sorry. I just like how Anaya said, protect the space. I really liked that phrasing.
Yes,
Anyway,
I do. And I think, Anaya, you're so right that in today's day and age, like it's not just about what you're doing for yourself, but how are you treating others and what are you expecting of others on that day, right? And even for folks that may not be Sabbath keepers, like what is your expectation of that, and I think that if they see you kind of modeling Sabbath keeping, and then also saying that this is space for you too to take a rest and not be working or whatever on this day, I do think that it can help people to actually kind of indirectly draw closer to God. That might not be even your intention in initially showing that, but then people can start to see that. It's interesting because, the lesson for Sunday goes on, and it really talks about these two passages as pointing out creation, which we already talked about, that by talking about, how God's creation story and how he rested, it's pointing us to God as the creator. But the part that I thought was so interesting was it talks about how the passage in Deuteronomy around remembering that you were a slave and that you were delivered really points us to salvation, because it's pointing us to the fact that, God delivered the people out of Egypt, and then he does the same thing for us through believing in him and through salvation to deliver us out of this world, into, eventually when he returns, into eternal life. And so I thought it was one of my favorite. There was a line here that I really loved, and it says here, by resting, we acknowledge our dependence upon him, not only for existence, but also for salvation. And it says, Sabbath keeping is a powerful expression of salvation by faith alone. That that symbol of Sabbath and that rest that we have, and that, that space, as Anaya said, that space that's created helps us to remember not only the creation, but also the salvation that only God can bring. And so, I thought that was very powerful. When I started the Sunday lesson, I was, kind of just focused on, the place of rest, like God delivering the Israelites out of Egypt and giving them a place of rest separate from slavery. But then when you really read those passages and think about it, I thought it's really beautiful to think about both creation and salvation all wrapped together in the Sabbath rest. So that those are the main things from Sunday. I guess the only other thing is there is a really great discussion question here for us to think about. It says, how should keeping the Sabbath help us understand our complete dependence on God, not only for existence, but also for salvation? So I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that, but I thought it was a different way to think about it. I think about it often related to creation, but not connected to salvation. So I don't know if there's any thoughts on how this helps us understand our dependence on God.
I was just thinking, listening, it seems like, we talk about that physical rest that the Israelites experienced after being slaves. I can't imagine they ever got to rest or put their feet up for a few minutes. But then when you relate the rest to salvation, I think about the burden of sin, the burden of messing up, not doing right, and how this rest transcends all of that with that faith that we will be forgiven of those sins because of Jesus' gift of salvation. That rest is coming, and that we can have faith that we are forgiven. And to me, once you know that you've been forgiven, it eases the burden. And when your burden is eased, you enter into a rest. So that was what I was thinking.
Yeah,
that's great. Well, so Anaya, that's all my notes here from Sunday. So whatever you can go ahead and transition us into Monday if you want.
All right. So Monday is titled Because of Unbelief. And the passage that it kind of starts off with is Hebrews 3:12-19. And I'm just going to read the first couple verses for us really quickly. It says, beware, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief and departing from the living God. But exhort one another daily while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. For we have become partakers of Christ if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast to the end. While it is said, today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion. And I think this part kind of ties into the story that they're telling on Monday. And Monday, they're talking about how all the Israelites kind of came to the border of the promised land, but says they lacked the faith that they needed to be able to enter the promised land. And I think that kind of ties into the conversation we were just having about kind of relieving yourself of your burdens and kind of entering the place of rest. And it seems like the Israelites at this point couldn't accept God's promise and accept God's rest for them because of their unbelief. So part of what I got when I was looking through this was I thought the discussion question kind of tied it in nicely towards the end, where it asks, how can we build the faith of our fellow believers? Because I think it's important when there are times like this, when sometimes it's like a communal sense of kind of dread, and it can be kind of a sense of unbelief. And I think, not to bring in the pandemic like we talk about all the time, but I think that we've been experiencing this as a collective where everyone's exhausted, and I think it can lead you into a space of unbelief. So what are some ways that we can kind of help build the faith of our fellow believers today?
And I think it's a great question, because I do think, like you were saying, that it kind of becomes contagious. Like, in the situation here, when they're so close to going into the promised land, people start to have doubt and say, we can't go in because, that we're not going to be able to, to stand up to the people that are there. We're not going to be, and they start to spread that. And then there's so much unbelief among everyone, like we just can't do it. And I think sometimes, I'm thinking about right now with the pandemic, I think that, sometimes it feels like insurmountable when people say, well, look at the data, look at how what percentage of people are having this, and it feels like we can't come out of this. And so sometimes I think maybe before we can kind of help to build the faith of other believers, sometimes we have to go back to the word and look at the promises God gives us. And he does talk about, like, that we're going to face these things in the end times, but that, he's going to be faithful to us and bring us through this. And so sometimes I think, I feel like, especially the last couple months, sometimes I had to make sure that I'm not disconnected from the word, that I'm like going back to that and really studying and praying, in order to then be able to share out and say, I know there's a lot of fear, but God is still with us, and we need to figure out, maybe right now it's not safe to worship together, but what can we do to support each other and worship online, or have small groups online, or do other things to help uplift each other up. So I think, I don't know, that's probably a long answer to your question, but I'm thinking, like, the first step, I think, is going back to God's promises, at least for me, because I know there's times that I felt discouraged in the last couple of months, and I've had to, like, really go back and hold on to that, so that then I could say, think about, okay, even though we might not be able to get together, and, because it's the safety issue right now, here's other ways that we might be able to support each other by visiting, or sending things, or, or getting together online, just to encourage people. Because I think people start to feel so isolated. And then I think that isolation kind of leads to sometimes more negativity if you feel very disconnected from everyone. So I don't know. Hopefully that made sense.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to acknowledge that first step, because if you just ignore the fact that it's a problem and we're all just kind of sitting here pretending like, oh, everyone's totally fine and this is all okay, then I think that kind of takes away and makes the problem worse. So acknowledging that our first step needs to be like digging deep within ourselves, making sure we're grounded, and then we can try to do that for others.
Mm-hmm.
You can't pour from an empty cup.
Yeah.
You can't share anything if you don't have that relationship, so you've got to build that. I agree.
Well, and I think on the back end, like, I think it's trying to think about creative ways to outreach to people.
Mm-hmm.
And it might be old. I mean, I know recently I've been kind of going more old school, like actually sending cards, because I'm like, people, it's funny, I was talking to somebody right before Christmas, and they were just saying, I feel so disconnected. I haven't been able to come to church because they have a chronic health condition. And they were saying, I feel so disconnected. I feel like people don't even remember or think of me. And so it sometimes it makes me think, like, what can we do? Whether it's sending, for some people it might be sending a text message, or, for other people it might be, putting something in the mail. But, I think those little things, I think, can make a difference, for kind of the collective feeling of things, even though it might seem like something small.
Yeah. Yeah. And then towards the end of this day, there's a sentence that really stuck out to me, and it says, God promises his children gifts that are beyond human reach. That is why they're based on grace, and they're accessible only through faith. And I think that's really important, because sometimes there are things that are beyond what we can understand understand, or sometimes there are instances where we just like experience this like undescribable peace that you can't explain through human measures. And I think it's also important to acknowledge those spaces where God is just so great beyond our kind of what we can understand. And I think just acknowledging that in itself is really beautiful.
Yeah, and just that act of sharing that act of sharing it renews it within ourselves and then encourages other people. So.
Yeah. All right, so I think we can move on to Tuesday. So Tuesday is called Today If You Hear His Voice. And that's kind of what the end of the part that I read in Hebrews was saying. It says, today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion. And it's kind of continuing the story from Monday, and how the Israelites were kind of stuck outside of the promised land because of their unbelief. And they become like the desert generation is what they call it. And it's kind of reminding us that God is inviting us today into the Sabbath rest, into just his presence in general. And like how today is such an important concept. And I think even in our language and just the way we use today in like our modern English, it's kind of removed from the context that it's used here, because I don't know, something's just kind of pulling on me that today in this concept is more impactful than how we use it now. And it's kind of more of like being in the present and in the exact like space that's God's given us. And it's calling us to make a decision today to kind of enter that space. So I guess the question that is on Tuesday is, what spiritual decisions must you make today that is not put off for another time? And I don't know, what do you guys think about that?
I like what Sarah was saying before, that the spiritual decision to strengthen your own faith and to build that connection with God, to build that personal relationship with him. Because to me, that's where I find my faith and my strength. And if I don't fill that part of me up, there's no way I can help anyone else spiritually.
Yeah. Let me preface this. So I think for me, one of the struggles I always have is, I like to show people God's love by doing things for them. I feel like for me, I struggle with the gift of like, I always feel like I'm not going to be eloquent enough to explain like biblical truths or to be able to explain things. And so one of the challenges that I've been having recently is thinking about a couple people in my life that struggle with their relationship with God and over the years have made some decisions to kind of, I don't want to say turn away from God, but they just have an idea of God, that God doesn't love them, that God, is an angry, and they just have this characterization of God, that God couldn't love them because of things that have happened in their life. And I think that recently I've been thinking about this a lot, because I think I need to make a decision and figure out a way to share God with them. And, even though I don't feel maybe like eloquent enough to share things, I need to figure out a way to share that, to be able to share those things, because, some of those people are having medical issues and things like that. And I feel like sometimes I put it off, and I put it off, and I think to myself, I don't have to share that right now. I'm going to wait until the time that it's right. But I think sometimes people are going through so much right now, and you think about illness and things that are happening. And sometimes we just have to step out in faith and ask God for the right words to share. So that's what I was actually thinking about when you read that question, Anaya.
And, I don't know, Sarah, I think that the acts of kindness and love that you give actually do show spiritual love. I don't know if what you're saying is you wish you could reach a little further, and but the cards that you write, you could always include a Bible verse or something there. Like sometimes it's easier to put it in another way than face to face. Does that make sense? I mean, I think there's so many ways we show Christ And we are promised that if we ask, he'll give us the words. But
Mhm.
that stepping out in faith is hard. It's hard for me. I understand it, but I see that like acts of love to me are spiritual as well. Does
Mhm.
that make sense?
Yes. Yeah. No, that
Okay.
makes sense.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about like what decisions, spiritual decisions must you make today and not put it off. I feel like sometimes there's been times where I'm thinking of a particular person who's really struggling and I want to say something to them, but then I get scared, and I'm like, I'm not going to have the right thing to say. So I try to show God's love in other ways, but sometimes
Mhm.
I literally, I was just thinking about this earlier today. Like I need to rely on God and step out on faith to be able to care more, and so um I don't know, that's just what I was thinking of when Anaya read the question.
Yeah, and I think that ties into the like promises that are beyond our understanding. Sometimes there's just
Mhm.
someone that like comes to your mind that it doesn't matter what you say to them, but they need to hear from someone that day. And I think that's also like a really important part of it.
Yeah, that makes
Those
sense.
are great
Makes sense.
points. And then kind of the last thing I wanted to mention for today was the last paragraph. It says, but Jesus has already defeated our enemies and inaugurated a new covenant. And that covenant allows us to come boldly to the throne of grace. So the appeals for today invites us to recognize that he's been faithful and he's provided for us all through this time. And that we have every reason to accept his invitation of rest and of grace. And that we can do that right now. It doesn't matter what like frame you're in, that he just wants to call you today.
Mhm. And that's such a good point, and I
Mhm.
If anyone doesn't, sorry, if anyone doesn't have anything else to add, I think we can go into Wednesday.
the only thing so this is, I don't, hopefully this is connected. I just am thinking about what you just said, and I was having a conversation with my husband the other day about, we were, so I used to be Catholic, and we were talking about kind of the process of confessional, and how people feel like they can't come to God because God won't accept them until they like go to the priest and talk about and kind of get all this out and have penance for that in order to be accepted. And so when you were talking about that like God wants us to rest in him, he wants us to come to him and talk to him so he can, help us to be able to have rest. I was thinking about that. It's I mean, having been Catholic, I understand that process of why, what they theologically think about that process. But I think that sometimes it's sad to me to think that some people may feel that they can't come to God the way they are. That, you know what I mean, and have and talk to God themselves and say, God, I need rest, I need help. I think some people feel like God won't accept me with these burdens that I have, or with these things that I've done, or these things that are heavy on my heart. And so when you were saying that, Anaya, about how God really wants that for us, just made me think about that, because now, I mean, now when I think about those situations, it makes me sad that people feel like they can't come to God and that God won't accept them because of these, whether it's something done or something that's weighing on their heart or whatever, and that they have to figure out a way to kind of get rid of that first before God could accept them and they could have any rest in God. So
Yeah.
I don't know.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And that, yeah, I definitely have thought about that before. And I think it also ties into kind of what's the culture around our church that would potentially make someone feel like they couldn't come to rest just as they are. And I don't think it's anything like overt or anything, but I think that's like a warning for us, like to be careful about kind of the way you interact with people that would make them think, well, I need to change A, B, and C about myself before I can actually like come to the rest of God that he's already promised everyone. So I think that's a really good point.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks so
And that
much.
leads
Yeah.
that leads really nicely into Wednesday.
Oh, that's
because
great.
Wednesday's topic is entering into his rest. So we know that we're supposed to rest from working, right? And that's kind of the typical view of Sabbath. We're not going to work today at Sabbath. And I've grown up hearing that, and I'm sure you have too. But what does that mean, entering into his rest? Because Sarah and I, you've both brought out that it's not just about the Sabbath day. The rest that God is talking about is multifaceted. It has many faces. It's the rest It's a reminder of creation. It was the rest given to the Israelites. It's the rest of salvation. So how do we come to it? How do we approach it? And in Hebrews 4, there's some verses that they mentioned for us to read at the beginning of Wednesday's lessons. Hebrews 4, 1, 3, 5, and 10. And I thought I might read part or all of those really quick here. Therefore, since the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. And I thought, if you read that verse just by itself, it kind of goes along with what your point, Anaya. Are we doing anything to cause people to think they can't have that rest? But it says the promise still stands. So it didn't go away. And it makes me think about salvation when I'm reading this. For whatever reason, that's what's hitting my head. Not keeping Sabbath by not working, but the promise of salvation still stands. I don't know why, but that's what's speaking to my heart right now. Hebrews 4:3 says, now we who have believed entered that rest, just as God had said. So I declared an oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest. Do you know who they're talking about there? All of a sudden it was so happy, and then God's talking about anger and that they never entered. And it made me think about, does anybody know who they're talking about? We've talked about them earlier.
I was going to say, this is referring to the Israelites, right? He was angry with them for not having more faith. And then he said, then you're not going to enter into my rest because you don't have faith. Yeah.
Okay. So, and then verse 5, and again in the passage above, he says, they shall never enter my rest. So I guess that goes along with the people without faith. But in verse 10, it says, for anyone who enters God's rest also rests from his own work, just as God did from his. So what do you think all of those verses are telling us about how God wants us to enter his rest? Are they connected? It's talking, does that make sense? How does God characterize the rest he invites us to enter, just from looking at those verses?
I think part of it, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay. I think part of it is something that he models. So it's not only something that he's asking us to do without doing himself, it's something that he himself does and kind of extends the invitation to us.
I like that. Sarah, did you have a thought? I know they seemed disconnected at first.
No, I was just thinking about, that I was kind of connected to the modeling. I think that God knows that this is in our best interest. And so like when I read through that, he's saying like, this is what I've set up for you. I want you to have this. I mean, there's the piece there where he gets angry and says, you're not going to be able to enter in the rest. But I think ultimately that's what he really wants for everyone. He wants people to be into that rest, just as he did on the Sabbath day. So I think, I don't know. Sometimes when I think about the story of the Israelites, I think how sad it must have been for God to have brought them out of Egypt, have them traveling through the desert, trying to get to the promised land. They get there and then they don't have the faith to go in. They're doubting things. And then, I mean, he was very patient with them. He kept trying and trying, showing them promises. And then he finally got to this point of anger to say, well, you're not going to enter into my rest, because I think he had just gotten to the point of, all those years, like trying to show you that I'm here for you, that I'm doing this, that I'm providing for you. And then you get all the way right there to the land that I'm promising you. And you're like not going in because you don't have faith. I don't know. I can't imagine how God
I can't either. And here God has his ultimate plan, and he's rescuing them out of slavery, which we could say equals sin, because the wages of sin is death. Many of the slaves died, from this torment and torture that they were under in Egypt. And And then here he delivers them. He puts the cloud of fire over them and the cloud of the pillar of cloud by day and the fire by night. He has them build this beautiful tabernacle, and all of that is pointing to his love, his protection, deliverance. And then that beautiful tabernacle pointed to the sacrifice that Jesus was going to make to save us ultimately, so we could enter the rest of eternity. And I think too, it must have been so hard for God when they just kept turning away. But to me, I think of that as a way for us to remember that this rest that God is giving us is multifaceted, and that it's intricate, but at the same time, it's really simple. I think God wants us to enter the rest that he gives us, the grace, the love, the salvation that he gives us, and be willing to accept it for ourselves. It's like some of the Israelites just wouldn't accept it. So then, Anaya, did you have any thoughts, or Sarah? I don't know if I cut anybody off or anything.
Oh, no.
Okay. All right. So I think that too, I know that further on into the lesson, I don't know if I'm going to jump ahead from Wednesday to Thursday or not, but I did want to read a little passage. In my lesson, they had some quotes from Ellen White from A New Life. I don't remember that book. Page 40. I don't know if anyone else remembers the book, but I really thought about the Israelites too, and how they were grumbling and complaining, and they just didn't accept what God was doing for them. Well, a lot of them, in fact, many of them, because they got stuck 40 extra years in the desert because of it. But for all that trying to, I don't know, wish it was better, all of that work that they were entering, that anxiety that was happening to them, we want to go back to Egypt, all of that mess, they couldn't accept God, that through all of that focus on the negative, that I think that they missed the positive instead of focusing on their faith or focusing on the thankfulness that God had given to them. And there was just this little quote from It's a New Life, page 40. It said, "We should not make self the center and indulge anxiety and fear as to whether we shall be saved. Commit the keeping of your soul to God and trust in him. Talk and think of Jesus. Let self be lost in him. Put away all doubt. Dismiss your fears. Say with the Apostle Paul, I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me." Galatians 2:20. So that rest, that resting in him and committing yourself to him, I think helps you enter into that rest.
Yeah,
That's a great point.
I thought that was a really pretty quote.
Yes, it is. It's beautiful.
So as we go over into Thursday, it's entitled A Foretaste of New Creation, which I think again is talking about the future rest in heaven. And down into the lesson, I thought it was kind of neat. It was talking about how, and maybe it was Wednesday. I'm sorry if I missed it. Oh, it was Wednesday. I apologize. I did think that it's kind of neat that it was bringing about the fact that when God gives us rest, it was after he finished a work. Like he finished the work of creation, so he rested and we get a rest, right? When he delivered his people, I think he even got a rest and we got a rest, and there were several examples of that in Wednesday's lesson. And I know we probably have to keep moving on. So if any of you want to dive into a little more of a study, Wednesday's lesson gives several examples of times that God delivered people and then they had that rest in that peace. I thought that was kind of neat. So I won't go into all of them right now. So a foretaste of new creation. kind of talks about Sabbath as a celebration and joy and thanksgiving. And I think that sometimes, I don't know how I want to say this. Sometimes maybe we get so focused on making sure that we're resting appropriately that we miss out on the joy and the thanksgiving. And that if we kind of rest in Jesus and think about him and the love and the forgiveness and the salvation he's given us, then I think our rest can be more complete. I don't know. What do you guys think?
I think that's true. That? I thought it was interesting in this lesson where it's talking about that in Jewish tradition, that's the way it's seen. Sabbath is considered like a celebration. It's joyful. It's Thanksgiving. It's a time to get together and to learn about God. But I agree. I feel like sometimes it becomes so, or I feel like sometimes it becomes so like rule focused that it loses that kind of flavor. So, Anaya had brought up a good point earlier about like the culture of our church and how that sometimes influences people differently or makes people think different things. I think sometimes, I remember when I first came into the Adventist church, I didn't really see Sabbath, was learning about it. I didn't hear anybody talking about it in this way. Like nobody was talking about it as like a celebration, joyful. Everybody was talking about like the list of like rules around what you can do, what you can't do, all that. So I think sometimes we, for whatever reason over the years or just tradition, however it has been morphed into this kind of more like rule bound type of thing versus, I thought this was a really interesting study talking about kind of the Jewish tradition of Sabbath and then that, what Sabbath is really meant for closer to God so that we can see his promises is kind of very different than what I first understood when I learned about Sabbath.
I mean, I know Jesus says like Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And I think sometimes, those rules get our focus off of the fact that he gave us that rest. Sabbath would still be Sabbath, whether we rested in it or not. Think about the world, the people that don't know that beautiful truth or haven't experienced the rest of salvation or the grace of God. And they're still going on. So I don't know. Does that make sense? I don't know if I made sense, but
I don't know. It makes sense.
It still goes on. Go ahead, Anaya.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, as someone who like grew up from when I was born, kind of knowing about the Sabbath and how we practice it, I think it also has to be something you accept for yourself because you can have it like my parents were a great example of it to me and kind of showed me not to focus too much on the rules and to just have it be a day where you sit in Christ. But I think until you accept that like internally for yourself, it's like a different experience. So I think that's
I think we've grown, I know I've grown in grace in this topic as I've grown up, but I liked that the lesson brought out too, that Sabbath is faith alive and vibrant. As far as actions go, Sabbath observance is probably the fullest expression of our conviction that we are saved by grace through faith in Jesus. I just thought that was the most beautiful thing. And it just, I don't know, it just made me so joyful for Sabbath. So one more reason for Sabbath to be a blessed day. Not only do we not have to work and we can kind of take a physical and mental break from all the pressures of the week, but we can be reminded of that beautiful faith and salvation and grace in Jesus. So I wanted to ask the question at the end here: how can we learn to keep Sabbath in a way that indeed shows our understanding of what salvation by faith, apart from the deeds of the law, is about? How is resting on the Sabbath an expression of salvation by grace? What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think that's a really deep question, actually, because it makes you kind of think about why you observe the Sabbath and not just you're doing it because, kind of like I was saying, just like you're doing it because your parents are doing it, you're doing it because this is what you decided to do a long time ago. I think it has to be like a daily decision, kind of like I think it was either Tuesday or Monday was talking about like doing it in the today, in the like present that you're in. And I think that's a good expression of your faith and of the grace you're giving yourself to like be present in that moment too.
And it's funny, I was thinking kind of connected to that you're making an active decision. It's not just I'm doing this because it's the tradition I've always followed, but I'm making an active decision. And to me, the active decision is that today I'm going to set apart time to be doing, I mean, I know probably many people do Bible study every day. They probably pray every day, but to do something special to be with God. And it might be something out of the norm, you know what I mean? So that something special could look different for different people. Maybe I feel closest for God going on a hike and praying and being in nature. Maybe someone else feels most connected with God, having a quiet time with themselves or with their family to study that's more in depth than they normally would have time to do, during the week. I think it's setting that time apart to spend time growing in our relationship with God, but making an active decision to do that, and maybe doing something that we don't get to do with God every day, to try to further build our relationship. So I think I like what you said. It's like making an active decision versus just, on Saturday we don't do this and that, and so I'm just kind of following along with that, versus being present and saying, I'm going to do this today to grow closer to God.
I like that too. Beautiful choice, to choose. And I love the fact, Sue Sarah, that you brought out also that it's kind of a personal relationship. We have a personal God and we each have our own relationship with him. So enjoying that Sabbath rest might look different, yet we're all still keeping it according to the law, remembering it, observing it in a way that not only brings us closer to God, but hopefully will also be a witness and example and encourage someone else to grow closer to God in their walk. Yeah. All right. So Sarah, I guess we'll turn it back over to you.
I can wrap it up. So, Friday is really kind of wrapping up the week. And it kind of, part of it is talking about how in the history of Christianity, we got away from the Sabbath, right? So it talks about kind of in the history of Christianity that at one point, Paul points out how important the Sabbath rest was for believers at that time. And that was really a symbol at that time of salvation through the grace that God brings. And so, when I was reading about that, I was thinking, well, then how did we get to a point where, like, looking at Christianity as a whole, not just as Adventists, but as Christianity as a whole, how did we get to a point where people, there's a confusion between Sabbath and Sunday? And so it talks about how over time, after, obviously after the time of Paul and those early Christians, it talks about how, historically what happened is the Sabbath became very focused. Like if people were keeping Sabbath, people would point out, well, it seems like you're, really wanting to follow Jewish tradition and not Christian tradition. And they started to disconnect instead of focusing on that God gave us the Sabbath. And that's a symbol between us and God. It kind of became, if you're keeping the Sabbath, that really is associated with Judaism. And that if you're Christian, you should really be doing things on Sunday because that's the day that Christ was resurrected, and that's the day we should be keeping as Christians. And so it was interesting to me, if you want to know more about that, it really is very brief. It's like really a little bit more than a paragraph on Sunday, but I thought it gave a really good synopsis of what happened. Like, how did that over time change when the early Christians, the Sabbath was so important to them? And now today, when we look at all Christian denominations, there's this kind of confusion around Sabbath versus keeping and all of that. So I thought that was really interesting historically. But then it kind of brings us back to that ultimately the reason Sabbath is so important is because it connects us with what we talked about in the beginning. It connects us to God being the creator and it connects us to salvation that only comes through God.
Mm.
And so, there was a couple questions I was looking at here, and it was talking about what is the difference between true observance of Sabbath versus kind of legalistic observance of Sabbath. I think we hit on that a little bit, Amy, in one of your questions around the way that we look at Sabbath, and is it just following rules, or is it something deeper than that? But I guess, like, reading this the history piece, I mean, this is probably a controversial question, but I think the thing that kept coming up in my mind, I have many friends who are different denominations, and they're very close to Christ and have strong relationships. And they will often say how important it is to rest in Christ, right? So they also, even though they don't keep the Sabbath in the same way, they often talk about the importance of resting in Christ. So it made me really think about this lesson. Obviously is about the connection with Sabbath and rest, but it made me think about, like, do you have to observe Sabbath to be able to have rest in Jesus? Like, rest in God. Like, I struggle with this because I have friends of, like, all different denominations, and some of them I think, are most loving and Christian people I know. So I think it made me really think about this. Like, obviously this whole study was around that Sabbath connection, but then what about people that maybe don't have an understanding of Sabbath, but they also still have rest in Christ? So I don't know.
Can you only experience rest on Sabbath?
No, I think
I don't know. It just made me think of that. Yeah. I understand the importance of it. I'm not nullifying the importance of Sabbath. But when you were saying that, it made me think too of my grandparents, who were Baptist Christians, who went to church every Sunday, who read their Bible, who my grandfather taught Sunday school, he played the organ. They were benevolent. And it made me think they seemed to experience a rest in Christ, as far as knowing that they were saved and had faith in Jesus. They did keep a different day. They did, but they did appear, they felt resting in Jesus was an important part of a Christian walk. So I don't know, Sarah, I don't know that I have an answer. Maybe we can go to to Anaya, because I'm telling you what, I'm learning a lot from you today, Anaya. I love how you word things.
Oh, thank you. I'm just
help.
You
teach us.
I definitely don't have the answers either. I think it's a really important question to ask yourself. And even just not in terms of the Sabbath, in terms of just having, like, rest in God as a whole, because I also have other friends who are either Muslim or who practice Judaism and other different religions. And I think it makes you think, like, about just the power of God, because I think he can come to all of us in different ways and kind of reveal his peace and his rest to us in different ways. So I think that's a part of it. And that's just something that's also just out of our, like, understanding, like, how this can be true, but other people can also experience the peace of God in the same way. I don't know. It's a hard question.
It is a hard question. And I was
Sarah.
I was hesitant to ask it because I feel like it is a hard question. It's a controversial question. After I said it, as Amy was talking, it made me really think that, yes, you could have rest, because, like Amy said, you could have rest on other days in God. But I think that maybe, thinking about the study, that Sabbath helps us to deepen that relationship and deepen that rest. And the reason I say that is because if you think about the power of what we talked about with Sabbath pointing us to God as creator, Sabbath pointing us to God as the redeemer, and salvation that's only through him. I think that if you really, like, to Anaya's point, if you really are being active and in the moment with Sabbath, that really, if it's not just following the tradition or following rules, if you're really actively engaged in that, thinking about what this means in terms of creation, redemption, salvation, I think that the only thing that could happen is for you to, further your relationship and draw closer. And so I think that, to me, like, thinking about that question, and obviously
that's beautiful.
So I'm sure there's probably somebody that has a much better answer, but for me, yes, you may be able to have rest in God, and different times outside of the Sabbath and all of that. But I think that what the whole point of this lesson is that Sabbath is helping us to further deepen that connection with God and see the power of God, and that all God, that all the things that God does for us in our life that we might miss just on the day-to-day of when we're running around working and doing all of the daily tasks. So I don't know. That's probably not
That was beautiful.
Perfectly theological
That
answer, but that's what it made me think of when you guys were talking, is that, I think that Sabbath helps us deepen that in such a beautiful way.
I love that. I love that, Sarah. And I like that. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I love that it's just the culminating act. And it, if we're not running around and we're not busying ourselves with everything else that we've been doing all week, and like to Anaya's point about our minds, even taking a rest, and that in that moment of quiet and still that we can stop and rest. I think, I just love that. I think it's such a beautiful culmination of the week, and it deepens our relationship. I love that. I love how all the answers kind of came together, and it just made me think that, there's so many elements to what we read in the Bible, and there's so many prophecies, and there's so many stories, and there's so many things and challenges as a Christian that we want to do. But I think that maybe they just all come full circle, and maybe Sabbath is that center. Well, Jesus Christ is the center, but maybe Sabbath helps us connect all of those dots and just build that relationship with him, because we can rest, because we have a moment to breathe, because, and I think maybe that does set it apart and make it special.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you all for participating, and to Anaya and Amy for all of your insights. And there's so much in this study. I think Amy pointed it out, and we hit on certain topics, but if you didn't have a chance to go through the study this week, definitely dig in, because there are several pieces that we didn't have time to get deeper into tonight, or this afternoon, whatever time you're watching this, I guess I should say, that you could dig into deeper, and that really would be a great study. So we'll just have a closing prayer before we wrap up. So everybody would join us. Heavenly Father, thank you for giving us this tremendous lesson on you, the giver of rest. And Lord, we just ask for you to help reveal to us and help us to deepen our understanding of Sabbath, of the rest that you really want for us, and that, help us to use the time on Sabbath to really actively seek you. And Lord, we just thank you for all that you do to sustain and protect us every day. We just ask a special blessing for our church community and those in the surrounding community that might be struggling right now. We know there's so many hardships, Lord, with COVID, with medical needs, with economic needs. And so we just pray for those that may be struggling, that they can feel your presence and they can feel you lifting them up. Again, thank you for all that you do for us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Thank you all, and have a wonderful Sabbath.
Happy Sabbath.